Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to yet another Anglo-Turkish Society talk. I'm standing in for the usual chair of such events, David Shankland. I also participated in such an event last week, which I greatly enjoyed, so I'm delighted to be able to do this again to introduce Emily Neumeier to you, who's today's eminent speaker. Emily is Assistant Professor of Islamic Art and Architecture at Temple University in Philadelphia. She's recently published her first book, I believe, which is entitled Architectural Revolution on the Ottoman Frontier, Greece and Albania in the Age of Ali Pasha. It's published with Penn State Press, and I think it sounds absolutely fascinating, Emily, and look forward to reading the book. She's also recently co-edited a book on Hagia Sophia entitled Hagia Sophia in the Long 19th Century, and she's currently preparing a fascinating study on the subject of Florida Orientalism, which I'm not sure we'll have time to talk about today, but it's certainly something which piqued my interest when reading your biography. But today's subject is a different one. In her presentation for us this evening, Emily is going to recount the story of a famous collection of scientific photographs taken by the Victorian British photographer Edward Muybridge. She's going to tell us how this collection got caught up in a sort of transatlantic exchange between the US and the Ottoman Empire, opening the door, perhaps in a roundabout way, for the University of Pennsylvania to secure rights to conduct archaeological work in the Ottoman Empire. Like last week's subject, this is one I don't know very much about, and I was really interested when I read the blurb. So I'm not sure how many others in the audience today know about this fascinating subject. So we're all going to be enlightened, I believe. So Emily's going to present some slides, and we'll speak for the first part of the event. I will ask a few questions, and then, as usual, I will open up the questions to the floor. We'll have a little Q&A at the end. So, Emily, over to you. I think you're sharing your screen.
Yes.
Perfect.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'd like to extend my thanks to the Anglo-Turkish Society for this invitation. I'm very much in august company, I can see. And I'd also like to thank especially Craig and Sarah for all of his organizing efforts, and also Michael Kotakis for chairing this event. That was a really lovely introduction. Thank you, Michael. And today, in this presentation, I would like to begin with an intriguing episode in the history of Ottoman diplomacy, which took place in the early summer of 1888, when Sultan Abdülhamid II granted an audience with the U.S. ambassador, Oscar Strauss. The ambassador had petitioned for this special meeting because he personally wanted to offer Abdülhamid a rather unusual gift. And at that meeting, in early May, Strauss presented to the Ottoman sovereign a complete 11-volume set of Animal Locomotion, an electrophotographic investigation of consecutive phases of animal movements. It's quite a mouthful, which is the magnum opus of the photographer Edward Muybridge. These large-scale albums were the result of a series of scientific studies on human and animal movement that were conducted on the grounds of the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia from 1884 to 1887. Now, remember the University of Pennsylvania because they play a really important part in the story. Now, the images within the albums are now famous. Perhaps you've already seen these images for Muybridge's use of what is known usually as sequential or instantaneous photography, which is a pursuit that many have argued is really laid the groundwork for motion pictures. So this publication is considered a landmark event in the history of photography. But the animal locomotion studies and their subsequent publication have already been the objects of abundant attention. But while this literature is concerned with more on the career of Muybridge and the production of the albums, in this talk, I'll be considering themes of circulation. How did these objects move around throughout the world in the late 19th century. And I take as my case study this very interesting account of how a deluxe set of these albums found their way to the Ottoman imperial capital in Istanbul. Most critically, we will be thinking about these photograph albums within the sphere of international relations, in which these objects served as mutually recognizable signs of modernity and technological advancement. So, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, I argue that the documentary power of the photograph made it an attractive new medium for one of the oldest occupations in the world, diplomacy. I know what you were thinking. You were thinking of something else, but I mean diplomacy. So, this story of intellectual exchange and self representation necessarily begins at its end, with my tracking down of the original set of Muybridge albums gifted to Abdülhamid, which are now housed at the Library of Istanbul University. As I'm going to explain in more detail in just a moment, it was not entirely straightforward to locate these albums. And the fact that a rare, complete set of these photographs has been almost entirely forgotten in the archive really reflects that the original terms under which these objects arrived in Istanbul as tokens of a diplomatic transaction, not as a work of art. In this talk, I will argue that the albums were sent to the Sultan as part of a strategy to gain favor and the coveted permits for the University of Pennsylvania's archaeological excavations at Nippur, a Mesopotamian site in Iraq that was then part of the Ottoman Empire. The decision to offer this particular gift also raises an interesting conundrum. Namely, why did university representatives choose to send, of all things, a prodigious compendium of photographs concerning human and animal locomotion, with the vast majority of the human subjects being fully or semi-nude, as the vehicle to promote their scholarly activities quite literally in the eyes of the Ottoman Sultan? Individuals associated with the production of the albums in late 19th century Philadelphia fretted that the potential indecent content of nude figures might be deemed unacceptable by the members of high society in their own city, let alone Istanbul. So, what rationale compelled the gifting of these same images to a foreign head of state? Today, I will try to answer that question by examining the evidence at hand, which is the albums themselves and various archival letters and reports, to determine the ways in which representatives from the university and American diplomats anticipated these possible concerns by couching their gift to the Ottoman Sultan in the language of progress and scientific advancement. In an account of circulation and reception, it's also essential to discuss the afterlife of these albums within the Ottoman context. So, the animal locomotion photographs, which were participants in an ongoing transnational competition over scientific technology and cultural achievement, may well have played a role in the subsequent decision by the Ottoman Sultan to gift a deluxe set of photograph albums to both the United States and Great Britain in 1893. And perhaps some of you are familiar with the Abdülhamid albums. So, as many of you may know, the Sultan had already begun amassing his own collection of photographs from every corner of the empire as early as the late 1870s, so several years before Muybridge undertook his experiments in Philadelphia. Yet it was only after the University of Pennsylvania sent their albums to Istanbul that Ottoman officials felt the need to mobilize the Sultan's photography collection as a tool for foreign relations, an elaborate game of call and response between nation states. Therefore, I'm primarily concerned with exploring what could be described as the diplomatic agency of photography. So, in other words, I'm an art historian. So, in my work, I try to think through things, through material objects like the ones that are in front of you, to consider larger issues of modernity, such as emergent bureaucratic networks, their accompanying infrastructure, as well as shifting ideals of various institutional bodies and governments. So the decision to send the albums to Abdul Hamid II also raises a theme that is more often discussed in histories of art in the pre-modern age, and that is gift giving. So before the emergence of the modern global art market, one of the most common forces for transporting a prestige object from one geographic location to another was the diplomatic exchange of presents between sovereign rulers. And while there is a robust interest in gift giving as a form of global cultural exchange in the medieval and early modern periods, maybe you yourself have been to a blockbuster museum exhibition on gifts. And my colleague Sinem Kasale has just written a fascinating book on the subject between Ottoman and Safavid gift exchange. Um, and despite all this coverage, gift giving during the 19th century, let alone the 20th century, which is, as you will know, a time of transition from empire to nation state, these time periods are rarely included in these narratives on gift giving. So even though royal courts were giving way to parliaments and constitutions, the biography of the Muybridge albums in the late 19th century serves as a reminder that the long established tradition of gift giving was still alive and well in the age of modernity. And art as diplomacy arguably became an even more pressing affair in the 19th century than in earlier periods as politics and foreign relations became even more globalized. And I think we can argue that this continues up until the present day, as our news cycle in the US last week was recently dominated by the Qatari government gifting Donald Trump a Boeing jumbo jet, which caused quite a fuss. So these kinds of topics and exchanges are continuing to be hot topics today. So let's take a closer look at the albums themselves. The albums that were gifted to Abdul Hamid II now reside at the Rare Books Library, the Nadir Eserler Kütüphanesi at Istanbul University. They were likely brought there around 1925 when the majority of the contents of Abdul Hamid's Imperial Library at Yildiz Palace was relocated to the university, which had been reestablished shortly after the foundation of the Turkish Republic. While conducting research for a related project many years ago, I will not say how many, I came across archival documents that first drew my attention to the fact that the University of Pennsylvania had sent to the Ottoman Sultan photographs showing, quote, the positions and movements of humans and animals. So it didn't say animal locomotion or anything like that. But just based on this description alone, I realized that it must be referring to this famous animal locomotion studies. So eager to try to, track this down, I went to Istanbul University to locate these albums. And once I started looking through the university's catalog system, I kept coming up short. So search terms like Muybridge, animal locomotion, and Philadelphia did not yield any search results. So I eventually learned the reason I couldn't find anything in the online system is because the albums at that point had been miscatalogued as views of Norway, Norvetch, which they clearly are not. But the library also luckily maintains in its reading room a series of binders containing thousands of printed thumbnail images representing individual photographs in the collection, which is a very useful analog alternative to the digital system. So as a last resort, I was getting really desperate. I began to start grabbing binders off the wall, off the shelves, and started combing through them at random. And finally, my eye caught the distinctive rows of men and women striding across the page, which is the instantly recognizable imagery from the animal locomotion series. And I just want to be clear, I'm not trying to criticize my colleagues at the Rare Books Library. Far from it. They're always very knowledgeable and accommodating whenever I visit. And anyone who's worked in a library archive knows how common it is for catalog entries to be incomplete. I'm simply in this anecdote, I'm trying to make the point here that these albums are not like the star objects of the collection, which is important to keep in mind for this particular story. So those thumbnail images in the binders allowed me to track down the gifted set of Muybridge albums, which do survive in good condition well over a century after they first came to Istanbul. The albums are bound collections of collotype plates, photomechanically printed onto linen paper. Most plates combine multiple sequences of photographs representing a moving animal or human subject from various angles, with each photograph capturing anywhere from 1/100th to 1/5000th of a second, depending on the speed of the subject. Muybridge's team was able to achieve these results by having test subjects walk, run, jump, and gallop across a fixed track. So a battery of 24 automatic cameras, triggered and sequenced by an electric current, was mounted parallel to the track and recorded the actions of the subjects. Of the resulting sets of animal locomotion albums, the one in Istanbul consists of 11 volumes and is divided by theme. So the predominant modes for classification among the human models appearing in the first 8 tomes are gender and states of dress. So volume 6, for example, contains views of females who are semi-nude and dressed in transparent drapery and children. And the final 3 albums are dedicated to animals, with separate volumes on horses, domestic animals, and wild animals and birds. Every individual plate, which is, here's an example of what you see here, has been stamped on the reverse with the seal of the Library of the University of Pennsylvania. In the inside cover of each of the 11 volumes, an example of volume 6 you can see here, bears a label in Ottoman Turkish declaring that the albums had belonged to the Imperial Library, the Kütüphane Humayun at Yildiz, which confirms the volumes had indeed been held there before coming to Istanbul University. So examining the albums in Istanbul led me to wonder whether the University of Pennsylvania representatives had made any special changes to this set intended for the Sultan. In other words, was this edition unique, or was it just run-of-the-mill? The answer lies in a further investigation of the circumstances surrounding the production of the albums. The Animal Locomotion series is a follow-up to Muybridge's early work documenting horses in motion at Leland Stanford's ranch in Palo Alto, so Leland Stanford of Stanford University fame. And these are the images for which Muybridge is perhaps now best known. Now, after this venture, Muybridge went on a lecture tour beginning in the summer of 1882 to seek out new patrons willing to underwrite a more ambitious study. After having heard one of Muybridge's presentations in Philadelphia, the painter Thomas Eakins and philanthropist Fairman Rogers intervened to explore the production of further studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Under the leadership of Provost William Pepper, the university trustees provided Muybridge with financial backing and studio space for a broader endeavor, including both humans and animals, which were acquired from the local zoo, I was amused to find out. So Pepper appointed representatives from the neighboring Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, as well as university science faculty from anatomy, physics, and civil engineering to assist with the project. The interdisciplinary group was intended, in Provost Pepper's words, quote, to ensure thoroughly scientific character of the project, end quote. So 3 years and $30,000 later, a little over budget, I think relatable. The studies were completed in 1886. As the project reached its conclusion, the university sought to promote its investment in the form of a publication. The resulting sets of photograph albums were made available for purchase and exclusively by subscription. The order form, which you see the front page here, lists the available plates, marketed to the, quote, art connoisseur, the scientist, the artist, and the student of art or of nature, end quote. In total, Muybridge prepared 781 collotype plates, each containing between 8 and 36 frames, making for about 20,000 individual photographs in all. Subscribers had the option of browsing through the catalog of plates, the first page you see here, and buying a collection of 100 plates of their choice or the full set for $600, which I looked it up and it's about the equivalent of about 16,500 US dollars today. So reportedly, only 37 copies of the full run of plates ended up being produced. And of these sets, the university apparently prepared presentation copies of the animal locomotion albums consisting of 11 volumes each, which were not for sale. And based on my examination of the albums now in Istanbul, it's clear that the Sultan was sent one of these presentation sets. The plates in these deluxe copies are not organized by serial number, which is how they're organized in the subscription form you can see on the left-hand column here. So the albums are not like sequentially according to serial number, but rather by theme. So in other words, while the consumer's version was designed to be a series of plates one could mix and match according to an individual's needs and interests, the presentation version sent to Istanbul stood as a coherent collection of images that allowed a viewer to study particular subjects, such as athletic feats or more mundane tasks like doing your laundry, in their totality. So if the act of gift giving is as old as human civilization, I would say that this dual production model is quintessentially capitalist and by extension modern, in that any customer flush with enough cash could purchase a product that was ultimately deemed suitable for a diplomatic gift to an imperial sovereign. Just as the announcements about the publication of animal locomotion were appearing in 1887, there was another major scientific endeavor that was in the making at the University of Pennsylvania, which is the excavations at Nippur, an ancient Mesopotamian site in modern-day Iraq. Now, the late 19th century was a heyday not only for photography, but also archaeology, when the study of antiquities transformed from a pastime for gentlemen travelers to a professional academic pursuit. So by that point, a number of museums, universities, and other academic institutions in Europe and North America were undertaking excavation projects, with many of these sites falling within the confines of the Ottoman Empire. This level of competition no doubt convinced the trustees of the University of Pennsylvania to support the institution's entry into an arena that has been described memorably as a scramble for the past. The evangelical Protestant background of high society in the northeastern United States spurred a particular interest in archaeological material that could yield physical or historical traces of biblical events, that is, sites from the ancient Near East. So enter John Punnett Peters, who was an Episcopal clergyman and archaeology enthusiast who was looking for an institution to sponsor a full excavation at the ancient Mesopotamian city of Nippur. Located approximately 180 kilometers southeast of Baghdad, Nippur proved to be of particular interest because the ancient city was among the most important religious centers of its time. So from the perspective of potential Philadelphia supporters, one of the main lures for excavating at the site was the possibility of discovering clay cuneiform tablets, as the ancient city was supposed to boast an important library. And if one were to find documents from the ancient Babylonians, so contemporaries of King David and the Egyptian pharaohs, they could theoretically be used to corroborate certain events or people mentioned in the Bible. Peters eventually managed to secure a meeting with Provost Pepper in the hopes that the University of Pennsylvania would be willing to sponsor the proposed excavations. By November 1887, Pepper and his colleagues had established the Babylonian Exploration Fund, which is a super fun name, in order to stage full-scale excavations in Nippur. The first expedition did not arrive in Baghdad until January 1889, due to a delay in obtaining the necessary permissions to excavate from the Ottoman government. The issue of permits is inextricably tied to the decision to gift the Muybridge albums. The site of Nippur was located in the eastern reaches of the Ottoman Empire, and by that time, Ottoman law had begun to restrict excavation permits and prohibit the wholesale export of archaeological finds abroad. So if the team from the university wanted their expedition to be a success, they would have to play a very focused game of diplomacy. In her recent book about the politics of archaeology in the Ottoman Empire, Zeynep Çelik has noted how foreign universities and institutions framed their, quote, relationship with the Ottoman authorities around the concept of knowledge, end quote. I argue that this general discourse of knowledge production was co-opted into a targeted effort to acquire the permissions to launch the first expedition to Nippur. So not to put too fine of a point on it, but a contemporary article in the newspaper of the University of Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvanian, that I tracked down in the midst of my research, notes that the gift of the photograph albums was intended to soften the Sultan's heart towards the university and incline him to give her scholars permission to carry away with them what may be left at Babylon and the surrounding country. So it's very straightforward. So we should note the corresponding timeline of events here. So the funds for the expedition were set up in the winter of 1887, and while preparations were being made in Philadelphia, the university arranged for the albums, the Muybridge albums, to be sent to the Sultan in the spring of 1888. And the Nippur team left Philadelphia that May, just as Ambassador Strauss finally secured an audience with Abdul Hamid to present the gift. And it was only after the Muybridge albums had been received that excavation permits were finally granted a month or two later. The animal locomotion photographs were thus deployed by the University of Pennsylvania to elevate its endeavors in the eyes of the Ottoman government. The design of the presentation copy in Istanbul suggests that this was a gift intended to make an immediate impression. In addition to the novel imagery of Muybridge's sequential frames, the albums themselves maintain an imposing material presence, especially when all 11 volumes are arranged together, stacked on a table. Because the collotype plates are printed on a thick linen paper and measure approximately 50 by 60 centimeters, each album in the set is large and very heavy, making casual handling difficult. So they are display volumes of the first order. All of the albums are bound in leather, dyed a deep wine red, and the cover of each features a prominent dedication in English, embossed in bold gold lettering, saying, "To His Imperial Majesty, the Sultan of Turkey, from the University of Pennsylvania." And as a gesture of deference, the portion of the inscription naming the Ottoman Sultan is larger in size and situated directly above the name of the university, which is creating this clear visual hierarchy on the cover itself. The correspondence accompanying the gift is equally florid. A letter sent by the University of Pennsylvania to the Ottoman court in March 1888, and only the Ottoman translation survives. This letter reads, "We, the representatives of the University of Pennsylvania, request that the Sultan please accept a gift of an 11-volume photograph album, being an example of humanistic and scientific achievement, prepared by experts and men of science of the university in order to capture with perfect clarity the positions and movements of humans and animals in a single moment. It is our humble hope that His Royal Majesty will inspect these albums with a favorable view, even though they are insignificant, and as a work in which the West is in debt to the East, with the University of Pennsylvania never forgetting that the entirety of the world's arts and sciences originated from the Sultan's well-protected domains." The university's goal here was to promote the value of their pursuits, so it's no surprise that the albums are touted in this document as an example of humanistic and scientific achievement. The letter also explains precisely what the experiments were intended to achieve, in an effort to counter any potential confusion about the nature of the photographs. Finally, the comment that the university would never forget that the source of the world's knowledge originates from the Sultan's well-protected domains is particularly resonant when understood within the context of the Nippur excavations. This calculated flattery anticipates the university's to the such as hoards of cuneiform tablets in the library at Nippur were under the jurisdiction of the Sultan. As I've explored elsewhere in my work, the Muybridge albums were not the last time that the University of Pennsylvania would deploy such tactics in the service of archaeology. Several years later, when the university hoped to renew the excavation permits and convince the Sultan to make a gift of some choice finds from the Nippur expeditions, Provost Pepper spearheaded the negotiations for purchasing a painting by Osman Hamdi Bey, who probably doesn't need any introduction here, but nevertheless is a prominent Orientalist painter and, not coincidentally, the head of the Ottoman Ministry of Museums and Antiquities. After being exhibited at the 1893 World Columbian Exposition, the painting that you see here before you at the Mosque d'Or, Jami Kapasında, was bought by the University of Pennsylvania and sent to Philadelphia. So it's significant that both the Animal Locomotion albums and At the Mosque d'Or ultimately met similar fates. Shortly after being bought by the University Museum, the painting was unfortunately removed from its frame, rolled up, and stored away in the museum's archives, leading to its virtual disappearance from the world. And it was only rediscovered about a century later in 2007 by my mentor, Robert Osterhout, leading to its conservation and the eventual exhibition in both Philadelphia and Istanbul of this long-lost work of Osman Hamdi Bey. In terms of form and content, the collection of instantaneous photographs in the Animal Locomotion albums and the Ottoman Orientalist painting by Osman Hamdi Bey make for a rather incongruous pairing. There's also the fact that the Muybridge albums were a gift, whereas the painting was purchased by the university. Nevertheless, these objects could be considered two sides of the same coin in terms of their circulation and reception. Both works were mobilized as a political currency in a very charged contest of scientific and cultural one-upsmanship that we already know quite well from museum studies and the history of archaeology. Unlike ancient artifacts whose triumphal arrival to the cities of Western Europe and the United States prompted the creation of entire museum departments and even the construction of new institutions, the transactional nature of these diplomatic objects, the albums and the painting, rendered their perceived value as works of art short-lived. After arriving in their respective archives, these items were forgotten in a matter of years. Now, in the last few decades, art historians have been striving to reevaluate both Edward Muybridge and Osman Hamdi Bey, bringing visibility and, yes, high price tags to their work. Today, if you think about it, it's inconceivable that an Osman Hamdi Bey painting would be stashed away on a shelf. Yet we must be careful not to project like our current revisionist view onto the past, because it can obscure the sort of original motivating factors behind the conception and mobilization of these artworks. Understanding the Muybridge albums as emissaries of international diplomacy naturally raises the question of what kind of impact these objects made in the capital of the Ottoman Empire. By the late 19th century, photographs had taken Istanbul by storm, and as it had around the rest of the world. So this wasn't unique to Istanbul. Sultan Abdulhamid II was a particular enthusiast of this medium, astutely recognizing its potential for creating what one scholar has called state-of-the-art propaganda. The Yıldız Palace photograph collection at Istanbul University, comprising almost 37,000 images, is a testament to the Sultan's determined strategy to assemble as many images of his domain as possible. As opposed to the realm of commercial photography in the Ottoman Empire, an example of which is in the bottom right-hand corner, which focused primarily on portraits and Orientalist genre scenes for the tourist trade. What could be described as official photography aimed to document the achievements of the empire, such as industrialization, education reform, and the maintenance of a vast territory that was represented through landscape views, anthropological studies, and images of historical monuments. And I just have a selection here from the Abdul Hamid collection. So these photographs were used in government publications and also in magazines that were supportive of the Hamidian regime. So in other words, the general content of the Sultan's photographic archive is really a far cry from the odalisques being sold on postcards in Galata. They're both photographs, but they are in kind of entirely different realms. So the stately and sober character of the Sultan's photographic archive, from student portraits to marvels of engineering, could be attributed both to issues of propriety within a court context and, as several scholars have argued, a wider ideological impetus to convey a sense of a unified empire under the Sultan's reform agenda. The sponsors and advisors to the Nippur expedition seem to have been aware of Abdul Hamid's particular investment in photography. Interestingly, the university representatives anticipated the medium's ability to sidestep any issues raised by asking the Sultan to accept a work of figural art in an official capacity. Upon the University of Pennsylvania's dispatch of the albums to Istanbul, a writer for the university newspaper surmised, "It is to be hoped that His Majesty, to whom be peace and happiness, is not forbidden by the decrees of the Quran to accept such a favor from the infidel, for the faithful are not permitted to have in their houses the image, either graven or painted, of any living being. As, however, the Quran has made no provisions against photography, it is to be presumed that Mr. Muybridge's plates will not be considered unholy articles, and so we wish them good luck on their mission, and may they have an instantaneous effect upon the heart of His Majesty, to whom be ever health and prosperity." So with such a high level of concern about Ottoman religious mores evident in this passage, it is surprising that the University of Pennsylvania opted to send the full set of images from the Muybridge studies, considering that almost half of the plates feature male and female subjects in the nude with, frankly, nothing to the imagination. So in the final presentation of the albums, there's no attempt to disguise that particular aspect of the project. So the deluxe set of the animal locomotion albums in Istanbul begins with 4 volumes dedicated to the series of adult nudes. And considering that this gift was intended to represent the university within this very high-level diplomatic context, one might expect that there would be some degree of self-censorship as to avoid any possibility of offending the very individuals the university was trying to impress. And perhaps this lack of self-censorship has less to do with religious or cultural differences between American and Ottoman society, and more with elite versus non-elite context for viewing photographs. The potentially shocking nature of the nude figures presented in the animal locomotion albums is not only a possible issue in Istanbul. As art historian Sarah Gordon explores in a recent book, in the late 19th century, charges of obscenity were a real and present danger in the United States. And by these standards, the plates from Muybridge's studies could have been deemed borderline scandalous. Thomas Eakins, the well-known painter and early supporter of the Muybridge experiments, was fired from his position at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts just a few months after the conclusion of the animal locomotion studies for removing the loincloth of a male model in front of female students. Even among the members of the Muybridge Commission, there was concern about the propriety of using nude models. One of them warned Pepper, quote, "The human figure series should, I think, be carefully examined and considered. There are probably some lines to be drawn with regard to some of the plates. That there will be objection in some quarter to the publication would seem to be most likely, if not inevitable. End quote. Um, and by the way, the image at the top of this part of the animal locomotion studies, I mean, most people agree that is probably Muybridge himself serving as a model in the nude. So the question remains, why would Provost Pepper decide to send such a gift to the Ottoman Sultan? There's no doubt that Abdulhamid himself would see the album because he was known to be an avid lover of photographs and would thus be very curious about the studies. So in her discussion of distributing the animal locomotion nudes in the United States, Gordon argues that officials from the University of Pennsylvania attempted to neutralize any possible objection to the overwhelming presence of nudity in the albums in the United States by adopting a three-part strategy, which was limiting access to the publication, leveraging their own elite status, and heavily couching the project within the language of science. So these same actors evidently extended this approach to the presentation of the Muybridge albums in Istanbul. Again, the letter sent to accompany the albums emphasizes that they were prepared by experts and men of science of the university. What's more, this missive concludes, the goal of our accomplished specialists in making these photographs is to capture the positions and movements of people and animals perceivable in an instant before they disappear, in order to make them known in the future. Within the context of the Ottoman court, the University of Pennsylvania officials were keen to ensure that the purpose of the experiments were made crystal clear, rendering the albums legible as objects of technological advancement. The strategy worked. A thank you letter in Ottoman Turkish from Yıldız Palace, which is today in the University Archives in Philadelphia, makes it clear that the gift was accepted in good faith by the Sultan. The note emphasizes that the set of photograph albums, being an exquisite work, would decorate the most exalted place in the Imperial Library at Yıldız. This comment graciously acknowledges the caliber of the studies and confirms the positive reception of the albums. It seems that at this point, the Muybridge albums found a place in the Imperial Library at the palace among the rest of Abdulhamid's extensive photograph collection. In 1893, only about 5 years after the gifting of the Muybridge albums, Sultan Abdulhamid presented a monumental collection of photograph albums to the governments of the United States and Great Britain. Each set comprised about 2,000 photographic plates and 51 large format albums. This is an enormous work. So this act of gift giving can be viewed as a gesture of reciprocity within the diplomatic context of the animal locomotion series arriving in Istanbul, rather than as a singular act of outward representation by the Ottoman Empire toward a Western audience, which I think is how it's usually understood. So, to be sure, Abdulhamid's wider project of collecting photographs for the imperial libraries was well underway before the creation of the animal locomotion series, but it was only after the gifting of the Muybridge albums that the Sultan felt the need to respond in kind and assemble a wide assortment of these photographs in his collection into a deluxe set of albums and send them abroad as agents for diplomatic purposes. Multiple scholars have pointed to a series of previous encounters between the United States and the Ottoman Empire that foreshadowed the gifting of the Abdulhamid II albums, particularly in 1886 when a set of illustrated U.S. Census reports were gifted to the Sultan, who is said to have pored over them with great curiosity. Now, I'm not denying the importance of that earlier meeting. To the contrary, the animal locomotion series in Istanbul is really best understood within a nexus of ongoing diplomatic relations, the steady flow of correspondence between the Ottoman court and foreign emissaries. And the fact that the Muybridge albums were sent from a private university and not a government entity signals the shifting landscape of foreign relations and how academia was increasingly taking on the mantle of soft diplomacy. in a way anticipating later developments like the U.S. Fulbright program decades later, of which I benefited as a Fulbright scholar in Turkey. So the census reports and the Muybridge photographs are also indicative of the ways that this long tradition of information exchange was impacted by the project of modernity, and that both works strive to document total systems of knowledge enabled by new pathways of infrastructure and communication. Finally, the political agency of photographic technology offers a unique opportunity to bring together and compare two sets of images, Animal Locomotion and the Abdul Hamid II albums, that are both in their own right milestones in the history of photography, but for reasons, various reasons, are not typically found in the same discussion. So, although not obvious at first, there are some overarching formal parallels between the two set of photographs. Again, the Abdul Hamid albums generally attempt to construct an archive of the scientific achievements of the Ottoman Empire. Favorite topics include group portraits of students, education facilities, military installations, fire brigades, factories, mines, shipyards, hospitals, and government administration buildings. Despite this wide variety in subject matter, surveying the arrangement of individual albums reveals an internal monotony that is like positively mind-numbing when you are paging through these albums. For example, albums 9520 and 9525 at the Library of Congress, which samples you're seeing here of these pages, they feature a long sequence of multiple interior views. Actually, they contain about 30 images of high schools in the provinces, alternating with images of the students from said school. And album 9537 features a long sequence of multiple interior views, all taken at the Imperial Naval Arsenal, industrial still lives that are all shot from one side of the room to take in as much of the space as possible and formally constrained by the strong horizontal and vertical lines of the architectural support structures in these warehouses. So I'm just gathering all of these together to really convey to you this like oppressive uniformity, which is a defining feature of the Abdul Hamid albums. It resembles the experience of paging through the plates of the Animal Locomotion series. The first volume on male nudes, which you see here, these are the first plates of Animal Locomotion, begins simply with adult men walking. So according to the subscription form, 6 different models are used for these images. You see 6 different individuals here. A viewer is really most struck by the constancy and the homogeneity of these gridded frames with men striding across the page. To be sure, there is plenty of precedent within Ottoman visual culture for albums arranged in a sequential format. So you may have seen the famous photograph album featuring regional costumes sent to the 1873 Vienna Exposition. And even before the invention of photography, we could look to the plethora of printed and painted costume albums that circulated throughout the empire in the 18th century. But all these earlier examples typically consisted of only a single volume each of plates or prints. So as a whole, the 11 volumes of Animal Locomotion and the 51 volumes of the Abdul Hamid albums take the inherently repetitive nature of an illustrated album to an entirely different physical experience, with the sheer mass of visual data really moving beyond documentation, and it really goes into the line of virtual world building. So if we adopt a new lens of diplomacy for both the Muybridge and Abdul Hamid albums, how do these case studies address the question of making modernity in the 19th century? Even though the gifting of the Animal Locomotion series was deeply entangled with a search for the ancient past, both of these sets of photographs represent an attempt to capture the dynamism of life in the contemporary moment. American officials and the Ottoman Sultan alike were aware of the photograph album's unique ability to capture both the contingency and the order of modernity. It's sometimes described as unity and diversity. The Muybridge and Abdulhamid albums explore very different subject matter, but it is not a coincidence that scholars have again and again made the same formal observations about both series of images, which could perhaps best be described as an aesthetic of regularity. The representative images I've selected for the purposes of this talk present their subjects more as scientific specimens than individual portraits, and this impression is supported by the photographer's decision to crop these frames closely and erase any orientation of background or scale. One scholar calls the background of the Muybridge studies a uniform grid of Cartesian coordinates, a kind of universal frame of reference. In this sense, both sets of photography take part in the broader cultural politics of modernity. They are underwritten by the idea that it is important to be able to use technology to capture life. By sending these albums to Istanbul, the administrators at the University of Pennsylvania were recognizing the Ottoman Empire as a cultural power and a unique arbiter of modernity, which is perhaps why they received such an ebullient thank you letter. The sending and receiving of photograph albums between the United States and the Ottoman Empire comprised performance of scientific and technological expertise, which for the University of Pennsylvania was a means of flattery, and for the Ottoman court, a demonstration of cultural dominance. Unlike the album covers for the Animal Locomotion series, which visually defer to the Sultan, each volume in the Abdulhamid collection at the Library of Congress gives pride of place to the monarch in its cover design, an example of which you see on the right. With the stars and crescents tooled in gold, to the calligraphic monogram, the Tura of the Ottoman Sultan hovering above the text. The dedication inscription below separates out the name of Abdulhamid in a larger size here, while the United States, Amrika, is written in the same size as the rest of the text on the final line. So everyone's clear about where they're standing. Archival correspondence tells us that the Sultan had presented the albums to the governments of the United States and Great Britain, quote, in order that it should be generally known in these countries what progress has been made in literature and science in Turkey since His Majesty came to the throne, and to show how greatly he is interested in the advancement of learning and education in his empire, end quote. While the Abdulhamid albums can clearly be considered an example of Ottoman efforts to speak back to the Orientalist discourse, the gifting of the Muybridge albums makes it useful to qualify the extent to which we can understand this diplomatic exchange through the terms of Orientalism. In Edward Said's description of this model, even though he defines the West as comprising both Europe and North America, all of his examples of the West imagining and encountering the East at this time period in the late 19th century come from Western Europe, predominantly France and Great Britain. So the United States is in some ways peripheral in this global system of paternalism and colonialism, at least in the late 19th century. And the fact that the Ottoman Empire and the United States share a marginal position within the framework of Orientalism shaped their diplomatic encounters. The excess and extravagance of both the Muybridge and Abdulhamid albums portray a need to establish oneself on the world stage. Acknowledging peripheral perspectives also creates opportunities to discover other aspects of modernity that are rarely discussed. And it's for this reason that throughout this presentation today, I've really stressed the importance of religion to both the American and Ottoman actors in this account, from the biblical underpinnings and motivations of the Nippur excavations to the various concerns surrounding the propriety of sending the Muybridge albums to Istanbul. So these case studies stand as a reminder that modernity should not be conflated with secularization, which is a lesson we're learning again and again these days. Scholars who have worked on the Abdulhamid albums have been quick to note that they met a fate similar to the Muybridge albums in Istanbul and the Osman Hamdi Bey painting in Philadelphia. They appear to have been received with little fanfare and were quickly shuffled away to the depot at the Library of Congress. This is sometimes taken to imply that the images essentially failed as photographs, which as a medium are hypermobile and prone to wide circulation. Yet reframing both the Muybridge and Abdulhamid albums as instruments of diplomacy shifts the value criteria away from long-range distribution to the ability of these objects to convey immediately and to a few targeted individuals a message of technological progress and, ideally, superiority. However, the albums were hardly luxury items from an exotic foreign land. The new and rapidly changing medium of photography constituted a language of modern identity mutually legible to officials from the Ottoman Empire and the United States. So, when presented with the Animal Locomotion series, which is in many ways an atlas of time itself, the officials at the Ottoman court responded just a few years later with their own atlas of imperial space. So, like the humans and animals in motion in Muybridge's studies, the images of Abdulhamid's dominion were meant to be captured, registered, viewed, and then, once their job was done, to disappear. Thank you very much for your attention and time.
Thank you very much, Emily. That was a truly fantastic presentation on a subject both fascinating and surprising in many ways. You've taken us through so many different themes this evening: modernity, globalization, science as soft power, the emergence of the United States as a great power. I think is another theme which might be teased out of your presentation. What we're going to do now is I will ask a few questions. I'll try and keep my questions to a minimum, and then we'll open it out to the floor for further questions. So if you've got any questions, please start thinking about them and prepare to ask them. Emily, I really love this paradox of Abdul Hamid, the pan-Islamism supporting Sultan with a pretty bad reputation in the West at the time, being open to receiving these explicit depictions of the human body. And perhaps this is a question which is going to be quite difficult for you to answer, but do we have any attestation as to the reaction of Abdul Hamid or his entourage at Yildiz concerning upon receiving these items?
We don't have any kind of, I mean, it would be great if we had a letter from Oscar Strauss like reporting directly on the meeting. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find anything like that. But I think like we can kind of read between the lines of some of the archival documents that I did mention in the sense that, if the fact that they received such a profuse thank you letter. It implied like directly, from the court. It to me that implies. I mean, if he was really like just if it was a total faux pas and he was utterly shocked and offended, I don't think they would be sending that. I don't think they would be sending that kind of thank you letter, official thank you letter. And the fact that they got the permits in the end, that it was a pretty clear gambit to secure excavation permits, and it worked. They got their permits, just a month or two later. So I think all of that implies that it was a successful gambit on behalf of the U.S. But yeah, no, there are actually intriguing. I briefly mentioned it, the U.S. census of the encounter where the previous U.S. ambassador had gifted to Abdul Hamid II this sort of deluxe set of U.S. Census records that had very nice lithographs and charts and things like this. And actually, we do have a description of the ambassador in his diary of that encounter. And he said that Abdul Hamid was really engrossed and fascinated by these albums and was just kind of sitting and just sort of poring over them and really, kind of voraciously like studying and taking in these plates. So Based on that, I'd have to imagine that there was probably it must have elicited a similar type of reaction from the Sultan, but of course we don't have a direct account.
Of course, it was a really tough tough question. You definitely handled it. Um, it's interesting to consider this comment you made in your presentation about elite versus non-elite attitudes towards these types of depictions. I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit.
Sure. And by the way, I want to just acknowledge, we've got people from all tuning in from all over. So I see that we have some folks from Philadelphia, which is great, Definitely my neck of the woods. So that's amazing. Yeah, so about elite versus non-elite, this is kind of um this is kind of I wouldn't call it a pet peeve, but it's something that I'm constantly trying to kind of work through in my own research because I think when we talk about photographs, we tend to kind of like lump them all together. When we talk about say like Ottoman photography, we need to be more specific about because I mean I think today it's really hard. I think it's really hard um, to appreciate enough, like, just like how quickly and how in terms of volume, how photographs really just like transformed visual culture and life in the second half of the 19th century. I mean, it was basically like instantaneous. It wasn't like, oh, France had it for, several decades and then it finally kind of made its way elsewhere. I mean, really, like in the matter of years, everybody had cameras. It was not a kind of a Western technology. It was sort of a global technology that was happening everywhere at the same time. Um, and I think that needs to be appreciated. And also, but it generated all this volume of images that was just sort of worldwide inundated everyone's lives. And I think it's important to understand that this imagery was operating at different levels, that people had different levels of access to certain kinds of images, that there was censorship, and some images circulated among some circles and other images circulated among others, which I think today, I think that's not surprising in today's world in terms of, censorship of images today, especially sensitivity around erotic content, pornography, um, and in the United States, we tend to be sort of very prudish about all of this. So we have lots of laws that govern these things. So anyway, yeah, so I think it's important when we talk about photography to really make it clear what context we're talking about and to understand and to really try to understand who's looking at these things and who's making these things and for what context. To be really more specific about that to the extent that we can, I think it's really important.
Fantastic, and I think the point you make reverberates in the modern world, as you say, but perhaps also in other Islamic empires. I mean, we could look at the Safavids, we look
Hmm.
at the Abbasids. You see very similar types of censorship or types of distribution of explicit material or types of behavior which are considered fine in certain circles, but absolutely not fine in other circles. And there's an interesting paradox. I think very explicit, very sort of harsh paradox in the other Islamic empires. Now, as a last question before I shut up and open up to the floor, who I'm sure have more interesting questions than I do, I wanted to tease out this idea of the US and its global position in the late 19th century. Of course, it by the early 1890s it had become the world's largest economy, but of course uh, its diplomatic power was not as significant as France or Britain's in the Near East. So I wanted to ask: does this event form part of a wider U.S. Foreign policy or diplomatic initiative, which involves academic diplomacy or soft power as one of its tenets? And what was that initiative all about when it came to the Ottoman Empire?
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for your question. I mean, I think especially in the realm of archaeology, it's clear. that while the United States was emerging as a major power in the late 19th century in terms of political industrialization, the United States population was growing at an incredible breakneck rate at this point. And yet, in the realms of sort of like culture, academics, science, I think it's hard to imagine this now, I think, in a lot of ways, but the United States, or maybe not, but the United States really was, really kind of lagging lagging behind, especially in the realm of, say, archaeology. So there was already, let's say, boots on the ground in terms of France, um, Great Britain, subjects of Great Britain, who were circulating with, especially within the Ottoman Empire, which was really kind of the field of archaeology. Archaeological material was consisted of the Ottoman Empire at that point. Um, and there were so many different early excavations and efforts to acquire material and bring them to places, to London, to Paris, for decades, beginning in the early 19th century. And the United States really did not get into that project in any kind of way until the late 19th century. So you could really see that these efforts were part of an organized effort, not on behalf of the state. It's interesting because the United States, unlike counterparts in Europe or even the Ottoman Empire itself, the state was never really responsible for any kind of like organized administration of archaeological projects. We don't have a National Museum of Archaeology in Washington, for example, like you do have in Athens or in Istanbul or in London. So we don't have anything like that. So it was really on the initiative of these private actors and institutions, principally universities and museums. So anyway, I see the Muybridge albums, and they're gifting they're to the Ottoman Sultan as part of this effort in the late 19th century to kind of quote unquote catch up in terms of their profile as a burgeoning center for science and culture and art.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Emily. I see that Andrew in the audience has raised his hand. Andrew, please come with your question.
Metaphorically, at least.
Yes.
And I'm also from Philadelphia, so I have a right to ask the question, although I'm not there at the moment. The picture you showed of Abdul Hamid is the one from the 1867 when he came to London and had his picture taken in Ebury Street, around the corner from where I am at the moment. Why is that the only picture of him?
That's a good question. Say what?
Given this great interest in photography, that he could, if he was happy to tolerate pictures of nude males, it couldn't have simply been because of a prohibition against imagery in Islam. Why was he so reluctant to have his portrait taken apart from? And you can even see, like, he doesn't seem to be enjoying this photograph very much when he's taking it.
Yeah, that's well spotted. Yeah, I was wondering if anyone was going to notice that. Actually, it is, just historians in general are hard pressed to find photographs of Abdulhamid II, and this is just one of my favorites. But it is when he's a young man. He's not even the Sultan at that point. He's the Shehzadeh. So, um, yeah, it's a good question. I'm not in the business of armchair analyzing Ottoman sultans, but I think from what I've read and what I know about Abdulhamid II, is that he was someone who was very interested in science, technology, photography, very passionate, but he, just as his personal qualities, he was very paranoid, and was always like constantly concerned about like security issues and things like that. So I don't know. I think he had, despite the fact that he was so interested in this like intensive like imaging of his empire, he seemed to have some kind of personal anxiety about representing himself in terms of sitting for official portraits. I mean, especially, I mean, of course he did, but I mean, I think if you look at, say, like compare with the Qajar rulers who were just like, just like constantly photographing themselves. Um, yeah, I mean, Abdul Hamid II is really kind of stands in contrast to that interest in, taking selfies around the palace. He wasn't really doing that. So in a way, it's interesting that in my mind, in the same way that Guru Najipalu has argued that in many ways and it's in fact appropriate that we have this image here of one of the imperial mosques, that Ottoman imperial mosques in many ways stand as portraits of their patrons, in terms of this kind of system of decorum, right? That like you can tell the status of a patron by how many minarets it has, by how many domes it has, where it's located in the city. This is what Najipalu has argued. And in the same way that mosques kind of serve as portraits of their patrons, it's interesting to think of the Abdul Hamid II photograph collection, the albums, the images of the empire, as almost like a stand-in for Abdul Hamid himself as this sort of universal ruler. Um, Anyway, but that's just me kind of reflecting and theorizing. But it's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Any more questions from the audience? Please just jump in if you have something to ask. Please just jump in. No need to raise your hand. We're among friends.
It seems like we have quite a Philadelphia crowd, so we can just sort of descend into talking about, sports teams.
Well, we could go there, but perhaps not yet.
It'll be a very Philadelphia thing to do.
Yes, sure. I just wanted to focus a little bit on the figure of Edward Muybridge in all of this. Obviously, Edward Muybridge is a British, very well-known British photographer, and he would have taken part in this research in Philadelphia. Did he dabble in diplomacy? Was he aware of how his artistic and scientific works were being used? What more can we say about Edward Muybridge in this whole story?
I mean, he didn't. From everything I've read about him, he was not the most diplomatic of people. There's all these sort of, he's a very colorful character. He was actually, he stood trial. He was accused of murdering his wife's presumed lover. He was acquitted, I will have to say, so his reputation stands. Yeah, he was kind of this colorful guy, and it's interesting in the I mean, from what I know about Muybridge, he was a real showman. Like I said, he went on this kind of, after the successful experiments in California, he did kind of go on the road and sort of showed his images, and sort of was a sort of one-man show. And so I think he was a very compelling speaker. I think he was a very convincing person. He was very charismatic. But it's interesting that when you read through the correspondence, especially the University of Pennsylvania, when they were discussing the organizing of these experiments on the university grounds, you really can detect the anxiety of like the provost and the board of trustees of the university, that they did not have a lot of confidence and Mr. Muybridge, they were a little concerned that there was always this anxiety that they were taking a big risk and giving him quite a bit of money, $30,000 in that time period is a lot of money. And so and like I said, I read one quotation from a letter that was written to the provost by one of the board of trustees. They were like worried. They were worried about our boyfriend, whether he could pull it off and whether, he could this could be sort of managed, this whole project could be managed from like kind of a public relations perspective. So I don't know. Like in terms of Muybridge himself, I don't know if I would describe him as like, an expert diplomat. Um, but he
Doesn't sound like it.
was but he wasn't, but he got the job done and he was a brilliant, obviously brilliant person, and very creative. And like I said, really was the driver of this really innovative experiment. So, but he was not put in the he was not sent to Istanbul to present these materials. Safe to say, he was not considered to be the best, most reliable representative
Yeah,
of
the best plenipotentiary on
yeah,
that.
they left it to good old Oscar Strauss. They said Oscar can go in there,
I think it sounds like a sound
you
decision,
know,
ultimately,
exactly.
given what you say about him. Yeah, it's fascinating because we hear about Edward Muybridge here and there. Obviously, he's one
Sure.
of the great photographers of the period. We just don't. I mean, at least I. Perhaps this is demonstrating my ignorance. At least I had never heard of this particular event, which I find absolutely fascinating. Now, I will give the floor another opportunity to jump in if they want to. But perhaps whilst they think of any additional questions, I wanted to ask one last question of my own on the Nippur excavation. We talked about the US beginning to hustle in the area of academic diplomacy and compete with Britain and France. This appears to be quite a coup of academic diplomacy or of archaeology. Do we have any knowledge of competition between the more prominent archaeological schools, Britain, France, who had set up shop many years before in the Levant? Was there any sort of animosity? Was it a kind of, oh, wow, the Americans are here kind of thing, or was it? Did it take them by surprise, or was this sort of something they were expecting?
Yeah, that's a good question. And like I said, if you really want to know more about this, Zeynep Çelik has written a really nice book about like the politics of archaeology in the Ottoman Empire. And I would say that it was really interesting, especially with I was at a recent last summer. I went to an exhibition at the Istanbul branch of the Resim ve Heykel Müzesi, and they had an exhibition on Osman Hamdi Bey, and it was really interesting. They had, paintings of Osman Hamdi Bey that he painted on the walls. But there was this other section of Osman Hamdi Bey as a bureaucrat, and as, the individual who was head of the director of the Ministry of Archaeology in the Ottoman Empire. And one thing that really struck me was there was just an entire wall in the exhibition of diplomas and certificates that had been gifted to Osman Hamdi Bey by foreign governments, to as like, to curry favor with him. So like, it was like the Legion of Honor and like honorary PhDs from Pennsylvania and Harvard and whatnot. I don't know, that sort of really struck me as a sort of a very tangible material representation of what this kind of scramble for the past was like in Istanbul in the late 19th century. I don't know if there was so much, once you were really on the ground. I mean, I don't think excavations were so close enough that, the sort of, the British guys were over here and like the Americans were over here. I think there was sort of enough to go around out in the field in that sense. But in Istanbul, at the you get the sense, especially from reading Zeynep Çelik's book, you get the sense at the Imperial Museum that there really was this kind of, people kind of coming around with their hats in their hands and kind of like, oh God, there's a French guy over there. And like and you see in their diaries and their accounts that there was this competition. Like they were like, oh well, like for example, that Osman Hamdi Bey painting I mentioned. So I'd worked on this painting and the purchase of the painting and the subsequent disappearance of this painting. And it was really interesting. I remember in the correspondence where they're talking about the University of Pennsylvania was talking about whether they should purchase this painting. I remember them saying something in the letters to the Board of Trustees. They were like, well, the French and the Germans have been buying Osman Hamdi Bey's paintings like to get archaeological permits and it's really worked out really well for them. So like we need to buy this paint as is an argument. We need to buy this painting to make Osman Hamdi Bey happy. So there was this like clear sense of anxiety on the behalf of the Americans. Like we need to like these are the strategies that our colleagues in other countries have deployed, and we need to be doing the same. So you do get a sense in the archival documents of this kind of competition in terms of, especially in terms of archaeology.
Fascinating. Well, thank you very much for that, Emily. And I'm judging by the lack of hands raised in the chat that it's time to discuss sport. So if anyone has any questions related, I'm joking. Well, I want to thank I want to thank you very much.
Go Birds,
Okay.
whoever's feeling good about the Phillies this year, let us know.
This is well outside my comfort zone. Unfortunately, I'm very much a football or a soccer guy, and the American sports, apart from basketball, are sort of a different stratosphere for me. But yeah, go Phillies! I'll absolutely wish you all the success with the Phillies. But thank you so much on your wonderful presentation. It was really fascinating. You've shared a treasure trove of information with us, both on this subject and around the subject, and that we feel, I think, thoroughly enriched by this. So, all that is left to say is a big thank you from me and from the Anglo-Turkish Society. I'm sure Craig and David Shanklin will extend their thanks both here and later on. And I'm sure you're always going to be welcome back. And whenever you are in London and you'd like to give another talk, I'm sure there'd be interest from the Anglo-Turkish Society side. So thank you very much, Emily.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you everyone for coming. And I hope you have a good rest of your evening.
Enjoy Thessaloniki. You're in a wonderful city. Make sure you enjoy it fully.
I will endeavor to do so. Thank you.
Fantastic. Great. Well, it's a good evening from me.
Thanks.